Okay, I found it.
I started trying to get my slides together yesterday, and I lost.
As you'll see, I only really use them as an enabling or need.
Okay, good.
Okay. Comrades, we're going to make a start. This morning's session, John, this morning's session is health and communism with Ian. You have the floor, comrade.
Good morning, comrades. Health and communism, a bit of a broad topic, I think you'll all agree. I'm going to kind of look at, it's a game of two halves in a sense. The first part I want to have a look at really is what we might call the bourgeois sociology of health and illness. I take the view that sociology, in a sense, is the counterpart to Keynesian economics. It grew up in opposition, really, to Marxism. Next time you're in Highgate Cemetery and you're looking at the grave of Marx and you're thinking of all the millions that have died in the struggle for the emancipation of humanity, and you come over a bit dizzy, you might want to have a sit down. Well, directly across the path is the grave of Herbert Spencer. No relation. And absolutely not. A well-known sociologist, racist, and originator really of social Darwinism. But really, even at that time, well, Spencer was influential in his own sphere. It wasn't really until you get to the kind of right-wing sociology of, the right-wing socialism and sociology of Emil Durkheim, first person to be a professor of sociology, and of course, Max Weber, really kind of the golden age, as it were. Max Weber in his famous dialogue with the ghost of Marx. So I want to have a little look at bourgeois sociology of health and illness, because actually one of the sad things is that Marxists don't write a great deal about health, which is kind of strange, isn't it? Because I'm going to argue that for really the centrality of health in the project that was set out by Marx and Engels. If you look through, for example, the condition of the working class in England, you can't escape Engels' references to the destructive nature of industrialization for the health of the population of Manchester. It's there throughout the book. If you look through volume 1 of Capital, footnote after footnote after footnote is about, particularly on the chapters around the working day and about the machinery, is concerned with the destructive nature of industrial capitalism on the health of the general population. There was a particular footnote that made the hair almost stand up on the back of my neck the first time I ever read it. And it was talking about the fact that in the factory districts around Liverpool, according to the reports of Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Factories, average life expectancy had dropped to 15. But differently, the working class really wasn't living long enough to reproduce itself, although that's not quite true. Average life expectancy is a strange kind of measure. It's often a measure really of the numbers of children who die. If you lived to be 5, you were probably going to live to be 50. And of course, in the context of 19th century England, to a certain extent, the Industrial Revolution didn't stall because there was the population of Ireland, there was the rural population being brought into the cities and so on. I should have probably introduced myself a bit more fully. Ian Spencer. I'm a nurse by trade. I trained in the olden days when you could be dual trained. So I was what was then called a state registered nurse and a registered mental nurse. No comments on that, please. And and after that, I went off to City University to read sociology and political economy under, among others, the magnificent Geoffrey Kay, who used to teach Marxist political economy, before later going on to the University of Glasgow to work with, to study under Hillel Ticktin and defend my thesis on the political abuse of psychiatry in the USSR. So what I'm arguing about Marx and Engels is that health is at the heart of the whole project. It's at the heart of the whole ontological project that you see sketched out in the economic philosophic manuscripts of 1844. That health is about the realization of what it is to be truly human. And that's very different from the kind of bourgeois conceptions of health that we generally tend to see. I wrote down, just for, if you ever want to get yourself off to sleep, have a look at the World Health Organization website. The World Health Organization of Health goes something like this. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. All well and good. So what you then end up with is either health as a statistical norm, or you end up with health as some kind of deviation from a particular status, or you end up with something which is really quite relativistic, quite subjective. From the point of view of Marx, I would argue, and here I'm pointing, of course, to the bits in the economic and philosophic manuscripts around alienation, the realization of what it is to be human is the objective of communism. And from that point of view, health is at the heart of it. Health, therefore, is part of the human telos. Health, therefore, is really part of the ontological project that was being put forward by Marx and Engels. Not only did Marx and Engels write extensively about health, but Marx, of course, had his own problems, as we know. He lost 4 children as a direct consequence. Well, poverty undoubtedly played a part in the death of 4 children. And he himself, if you've ever wondered about Marx's boils, the secret can be revealed. He suffered from hydrodentitis suppurativa. And it took me a while to practice that. Not just boils, but really bad boils. So, on to the bourgeois sociology of health and illness. A young writer, Richard Wilkinson, an epidemiologist who used to work on a building site and therefore asked different questions, wrote a letter to New Society in 1976, pointing out that notwithstanding decades of the National Health Service, inequalities in health not only persisted, but appeared to be getting worse. How interesting. To a certain extent, the bourgeois sociology of health and illness is a little bit of a darling to the kind of Labour left, or even to the Labour Party in general, and the National Health Service is something of a darling, as we know. I'm going to argue here, and I won't be saying anything unusual, really, that the National Health Service was, of course, the nationalisation and rationalisation of poor law healthcare that pre-existed it, and, of course, voluntary institutions. As a consequence of the letter in New Society, David Ennals, who was Labour Health Secretary at the time, established a Royal Commission on Health Inequality in 1977. And in the meantime, of course, the Labour Party lost power. Royal Commissions drag on a bit, you know. And in 1980, as the Tories had come into power, they did the barest minimum to publish the results of the Royal Commission on Health Inequality. You know, so they published one for the British Library, one for the House of Commons Library, one for the House of Lords Library, and therefore hoped to just simply bury it. But in 1982, Peter Townsend, no relation to the lead singer of The Who, and Nick Davidson published The Black Report, Inequality, as a paper, really a bestseller, certainly for a sociology book, a bestseller in 1982. And if you read the book, and I've read it to pieces now, I've used it that many times, it's full of little graphs that show a class gradient in almost every single condition you can think of. And it goes from what you might expect, heart disease, strokes, but also things like accidents in children, things like cancers, and a whole range, not only early mortality, but worse morbidity. And each condition has a class gradient. The only exceptions, I think, at the time were malignant melanoma from lying about in the sun too much, and possibly anorexia nervosa, which seemed to be a slightly more preponderant among middle-class girls. But apart from that, class gradient, the poorer you were, the worse it was. And again, something that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I read it was if the data for social class 1, this is the old Registrar General's classification, if the death rates for social class 5 had been the same as social class 1, the lives of 70,000 people would not have died, and that included 10,000 children. So inequalities in health have a real impact on people's lives. But in the Black Report, there really wasn't a great deal of recommendations, and there weren't a lot of recommendations. There were kind of typical kind of social policy recommendations, more research, more access to health, blah, blah, but nothing dramatic. And what was also missing really was the mechanism by which this takes place. Because on a day-to-day basis, if you listen to anybody talking about inequalities in health, it's generally because the working class eats sausages or smoke or some other thing. And a lot of it's put down to really kind of lifestyle choices. And that's the fundamental thing with sociology of health and illness. It leaves itself open to this kind of interpretation. What I'm going to argue is that it's, as you might expect, a bit more complicated than that. So in 1967, the beginning of the Whitehall studies, this is looking at Whitehall. Whitehall here is just being used as a shorthand for civil servant. So we're not talking about people who are dirt poor. We're talking about people who are in employment. I appreciate those of you who are civil servants, you're not exactly flush, but nevertheless, you're not talking about people who are on the dole. You're talking about, but also, of course, the thing about the civil service is it has a rank structure. And the Whitehall study, which was a study of 17,500 male civil servants, civil service rank was the best predictor of life expectancy and the best predictor of morbidity as well. By the time you get to Whitehall 2, which was between 85 and 88, they realised that women worked in the civil service as well. Who knew? And 10,308 civil servants of both sexes were studied in a longitudinal study, and it's still going on. And status, interestingly, seems to exert an influence independently merely of poverty. So it's one thing to be dirt poor. It's another thing to have all your basic needs met. But the rest of inequalities, in health at least, are often the result of status inequality. How does this happen? This is Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is the one wearing the hat. He'll be there in a minute, don't worry. Robert Sapolsky is a professor at Stanford University. He's basically a primatologist whose main interest is in baboons on the Serengeti, and he studied them for decades. And he's interested, and his PhD was on the endocrinology of stress. And his really most widely read book, I think, is probably called, is the one it's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And here's the scenario. The tantalizing aspect of it was that the blood profile of low-ranking baboons on the Serengeti is very similar to the blood profile of low-ranking civil servants in Whitehall. Okay, what's going on? If you're being chased by a lion, and it's not likely to happen today, but if you are, there are certain things you really want to happen. You want cortisol on your side. You really want to have blood sugar released and look sharp about it. And moreover, we'll do a couple of other things. We'll make your blood a bit stickier because that's good. Because if the lion bites you on the arse, you really want it to clot quickly and you want therefore to survive. Under those circumstances, Stress hormones are lifesavers, and anyone who's suffered from Addison's disease will tell you all about that. But what then happens, of course, is that the flight or fight mechanism is over, you've survived another day, happy days, and your blood cortisol level returns to normal. That isn't the same if your boss is an asshole. And what then happens is that you're in a constant state of arousal, a constant state of flight or fight, and more is going on. Not only is your blood a bit thicker, a bit stickier, but also blood sugars being mobilized. And what you end up with, of course, is insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and so on and so forth, which will take 10 years off your life. So Sapolsky's work, Sapolsky's no Marxist. He's a biological determinist, and his book, and I recommend it highly, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. It's called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. It's an extremely good book, and actually, while you're at it, you might want to catch his online free lectures at Stanford University. So why zebras don't get ulcers is that they've gone through the fight or flight mechanism, they survived to live another day, and they get better, and they're all right. And that's it. But in humans, under constant stress, low status, low amount of control over your working environment, not only do we have the things happening that I've already mentioned, high blood sugar and so on, but also other things. We'll switch off key areas like reproduction. You don't need to think about reproduction if you're running away from a lion. You don't need to think about you don't need to necessarily need all the aspects of your immune system if you're under constant threat. So what you end up with is higher rates of cancer. The immune system is crucial to keeping cancer under control. So this is one of the reasons why you see poorer people having more cancer. Not because they're smoking, not because they're eating sausages all the time or whatever, but it's a crucial interaction. And it comes back to another point as well, and it's something that cropped up yesterday, this crucial interaction between genetics and the environment. And it's a constant movement, a constant, yes, I'll use the term dialectic. It's a constant dialectic between nature, environment, and our working on the environment. And in so doing, we change the environment, and in so doing, we change ourselves. Rosetto, Pennsylvania, in 1963, was studied by Dr. Stuart Wolfe. And he noticed something. The people in Rosetto, Pennsylvania, generally lived about 10 years longer than the surrounding population. Not only did they live about 10 years longer, but they were healthier. There were no recorded incidents, for example, of the need for open heart surgery. There were very few, there were no requirements at all for any kind of assistance to old people in Rosetto, Pennsylvania, whether in terms of welfare payments or in terms of Medicaid, Medicare, that kind of thing. The interesting thing about the people of Rosetto, Pennsylvania, was that they were poor Italian immigrants. And kind of one of the first things that people thought was, oh, they're Italian, oh, they'll be drinking olive oil and doing things like that, you know, quaffing olive oil. They were poor. They fried everything in lard. The fat content of the people of Rosetto, Pennsylvania, was actually higher than the general population. We now know actually that fat was something of a red herring in terms of epidemiology of heart disease, but it wasn't known then. But what is interesting is that not only was the fat quite high, but the obesity rates were quite high, and also they smoked. They smoked unfiltered cigarettes and things like that. So what the hell's going on? Why were they living longer? And of course, it's actually come now to be known as the Rosetto effect, where you get a very strong protective factor from social cohesion. And what you had in Rosetto, Pennsylvania, were poor Italian immigrants. Most of the men worked in slate quarries. All almost all of them were Italian Roman Catholic, and so people would tend to socialise with, you know, men would be in the band or this, that, or the other, and there were things associated with the church. And it was a powerful protective effect on the health of the people of Roseto. And the interesting thing is that as the wealth of the people of Roseto increased, the health declined to US average standards. So what we're seeing then is a complex interrelationship between environment and genetics, and of course, what's become increasingly well known is the area of epigenetics. The fact that you can actually get, over a relatively short period of time, an epigenetic effect. And this is a bit scary because it starts to sound a bit like Lamarckianism, the idea of inherited, acquired characteristics. And if you want a quick look at that, look at the Dutch hunger winter of 1944-45, when the people of Holland were extremely hungry. And what you got is the children of women who were starving had much higher rates of obesity and much higher rates of type 2 diabetes. How interesting. And moreover, the children of those children tended to have higher rates of obesity, despite the fact that these were no longer starving. I move on. We come back to Richard Wilkinson, who wrote that letter in New Society. Anyone remember that? New Society. Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson published in 2009, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. Now, not only do we have the situation where hierarchically flat societies appear to be better for you, as in Roseto, Pennsylvania, but that has an international comparisons can be made on the basis of that. International comparison. So where the crucial thing seems to be not gross domestic product, for example, but the gap between rich and poor. The wider that gap, usually the worse the health outcomes. And the classic case, of course, the United States of America, which spends more in terms of gross domestic product than any other nation in the world, but achieves worse outcomes than far poorer countries. Now, of course, the fact that lots of people are not even eligible for healthcare plays a part, but actually healthcare delivery systems are not necessarily the crucial thing. I'm not here, incidentally, criticising the NHS, although I've said it's really the rationalisation and nationalisation of the poor law and voluntary sectors. I would defend the right to free healthcare with my life if necessary. It's a crucial aspect, and it's the one aspect, in a sense, that is the most popular and the closest to communism. Not equality, but distribution according to need. My daughter has cystic fibrosis. She needs more healthcare than somebody who doesn't. Why would you want equality of healthcare? All right, you all start off with 100 healthcare points each, and once they've all gone, that's it. We'll just knock you on the head. No, what we want is distribution according to need. It's the most communistic aspect, the only communistic aspect of the NHS, and it's the most popular aspect of the NHS. So communists should take health seriously. Back to Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. What the book consists of, it's a bit turgid really, but it's well worth a read. And it's a lot of scattergrams, if you like, those sorts of things, with regression lines through them. You know, you can see the closer they are to the line, the more the correlation is supported. And consistently, the USA, for example, comes out as one of the worst places to be in terms of health. And not because they're not spending money on healthcare, they're spending it out of the wazoo. But, you know, but what you've got is a worse outcome, for example, than Spain. Even a worse outcome than, dare I say it, Cuba. The inner level, by the way, is almost a kind of supplementary issue, really. It focuses on mental health and well-being. The interesting thing about Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson is they were a little bit of a sort of darling of the Labour left. And in a sense, it's kind of stands almost as a substitute for talking about class, really. But you can infer it. The other thing, incidentally, when you look at all 50 US states, the same pattern applies. So Texas, really bad. New England, generally pretty good. And you see the same kind of distribution. More unequal societies tend to have worse health outcomes. This is the bit where I'm going to kind of go off a little bit into my own little hobby horse as an old asylum attendant. This is Netherton Hospital in Surrey, where I trained in 1979. No one on the left, well, no one in general, but no one on the left really had much love for these institutions. The same people who now will have to sell their grandmother's house to pay for their care in a care home of questionable quality. We're not particularly wanting to defend the asylums, and look, I'm not defending them myself, with good reason. Some of the backwards in that hospital there were pretty dire, and most of those were made up of people who had grown old in the institution. They've been chronically institutionalized, if not lobotomized. I remember seeing chaps walking around with 2 little telltale scars in the hairline from the days when psychosurgery amounted to little more than putting a scalpel in and wiggling it about a bit. But the point is, of course, when it comes to mental health, you get all sorts of weird kind of things being said, don't you? You get all that somehow there's health over there, somatic health, real kind of diseases with bacteria and stuff like that you can look at under the microscope. And there's mental health over there. Oh, he's off with stress. Well, the point is that that too is a feature of capitalism. That too is a feature of exactly the same kind of stress mechanisms that I've mentioned before. And that too should therefore be of ultimate concern to communists everywhere. Just for the record, I currently work at County Durham and Darlington NHS Trust, and I work on the bank, so I go wherever they're short staff. And I've done a few shifts recently as well at Durham Prison, which is interesting. Bloody hell. It's not accidental that as they close the asylums, the prison's filled up. Funny that. Durham Prison has a whole wing dedicated purely to mental health. These are all people with serious psychiatric disorders who are being kept in a prison. What the hell? There is a whole wing for people who have to take methadone. What? When I worked there, what was supposed to be the bad old days of mental health, people would come into psychiatric hospitals for detoxification. Now, when I do a bank shift on a medical ward in Durham, I'm dealing with people who are being detoxified on a general medical ward with general nurses who, bless their cotton socks, do an excellent job, but are not in a position necessarily to give the kinds of care that's needed to people who are coming off heroin or indeed alcohol or whatever else. Just want to mention a couple of other little things. In those days, we also used to talk about organic mental disorders and functional mental disorders, reinforcing this kind of mind-body dualism nonsense, really. As a Marxist, we are consistent materialists, surely. And I'm here making an argument in favour of the reality of psychiatric disorders. And in particular, I'm going to mention one. Why? Because I used to work in a unit which specialised in the care of people with severe and enduring mental illness. And the majority of those were people with personality disorders, and a high proportion of those self-harmed. And I'm not talking about people who scratch themselves a bit. I'm talking about somebody who on one occasion got close to disemboweling themselves. Even the other day, I wasn't involved. I was off giving out meds on A-wing, and somebody managed to cut down on their forearm deep enough to get to be able to expose tendons. Unsatisfied with the progress of the knife, bit through the tendons. How much mental pain do you have to be in to do that? Now, the tendency on the part of at least some people is to simply say people with personality disorders are not very nice. actually, a lot of them are really nice. But they might do things which are not very nice, but we're not talking about somebody who's having a good time. We're not talking about somebody, if we're talking about schizophrenia, for example, who's having an alternative experience, man. You know, these are people who are suffering quite badly. Humans are social animals, and that's part of the essence of what it is to be human. Imagine, as a social animal, you just don't care. You don't have a conscience. You don't care if something dreadful happens to someone else. You don't care if you've done something dreadful to someone else. And you don't care that you don't care. And the tendency was, and you hear it in the popular press, you will hear it all over the place, really, that they should just be locked away and that's it. And there's nothing you can do about it. I've even had conversations with consultant psychiatrists who said, well, there's nothing you do about personality disorders. That's it. And so they just end up treating them symptomatically, loads of drugs. And if anyone's interested, generally, antipsychotic medication will take about 10 years off your life. You see relatively much reduced life expectancy in, for example, people who are treated for chronic schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and so on. There's lots of reasons for that. It's complicated, but nevertheless, it's important. James Fallon is a noted neurosurgeon in the United States. And he wrote a book, and I'm going to take issue with the title, but nevertheless, he wrote a book, and it's called The Psychopath Inside. And James Fallon, his party trick is he used to take positron emission tomography scans. And the thing about PET scans is that they can detect the activity of the brain. So this bit's work, you can put somebody in a PET scanner, show them a picture of something. Oh, that area, the pleasure area lights up, this kind of thing. What he was able to do with PET scans is go psychopath, normal, psychopath, normal, psychopath, normal. We don't tend to use psychopath these days, we tend to talk about personality disorder. Psychopath effectively became a juridical concept in the Mental Health Act until the last iteration of the Mental Health Act when it was taken out. Psychopathic disorder was one of the things you could be detained in the psychiatric hospital section. Psychopathic term isn't used anymore. It's pejorative. It's distinctly unpleasant. So is personality disorder, but what are you going to do? Okay. So there's James Fallon messing about with his PET scans. And as a wild card, he threw in his own PET scan. Guess where it came out? Absolutely. Yes. James Fallon, the psychopath. How do we explain this? He's not in prison. He's not in a psychiatric hospital. He's a highly respected neuroscientist in the United States. Or is he? He asked his family, and his mum said, well, you talk as if you come from a normal family. What's the matter with you? Go back far enough, he was related to Lizzie Borden, who took an axe and with 40 whacks killed her mum. And there were a number of murderers in his family. So what Fallon is pointing to is a genetic trait, as it were, related to personality disorder. He also did something else. He went around and asked all his friends, what do you think of me? And they tended to say, well, actually, we've always known you were a bit weird. So he recounts in his book, and well worth a read. Or you can look at his stuff on YouTube. It's very entertaining. Where I think it was his brother's wedding or something like that. And he just didn't bother going because he had a better offer. It didn't bother him. He wasn't worried about it. He didn't feel guilty of it. He just didn't go. Had a better time somewhere else. The point I'm making about this is that he didn't end up in prison. He didn't end up on some psychiatric institution. He's a highly respected neuroscientist. And he had a loving family, and he had a good middle class upbringing, and a pretty comfortable life, really. So the idea, for example, that someone with a personality disorder is a bad person, what you find is that they're not treated. Specialist services for personality disorders are diminishing everywhere. I also want to mention something about what we might call anti-psychiatry. Something about anti-psychiatry. And the reason why I want to mention this really is because this is one of those areas where, in a sense, Marxists left the field to a bunch of chancers. This is Ronald David Lang, author of The Divided Self. When The Divided Self was published by Tavistock Publishing in the early 1960s, it kind of rose without trace. Really, it was the New Left and the radicalism of the 1960s that made R.D. Lang. There's also this character, Irving Goffman. Some people may know about him. Lots of very well-known books, and they still get trotted out in sociology courses. Irving Goffman's Asylums, in particular, Stigma. Asylums is interesting. It was published in a very interesting year, 1961. Why was that year particularly interesting? Firstly, it was the year I was born, made it really good. But it was also the year Enoch Powell made another speech, the Water Tower speech, which people sometimes forget. When the Conservative government today, Enoch Powell was health minister, and really effectively announced the decision to close down the asylums. By the time I started my training in 1979, what we saw was the fields had all been sold off because the patients would come out and they would work in the fields, you know, kind of cutting corn or whatever they did. There were in Netherland Hospital that I showed you, there was an orchard, there were chicken sheds and that kind of thing. It was so it was run on the basis of agricultural labour, and incidentally, psychiatric nurses, which weren't called psychiatric nurses until relatively recently, but asylum attendants, were paid commensurate with agricultural labour really right up until the Second World War, just after the Second World War. Anyway, back to Goffman's Asylums. If you read it, actually it's facile. So Goffman is talking about total institutions, and he draws an equivalence, for example, between psychiatric hospitals and concentration camps, seriously, monasteries and all sorts of other things, ignoring the kind of huge differences there are between these different institutions. The point is, though, that Goffman was pushing at an open door. There was already a movement against the idea of having the institutional care of psychiatric patients. And again, you don't feel automatically impelled to jump to the defense of big old asylums. But what you now have is a situation where, for example, as I say, neurodegenerative disorders appear to be almost unique, really, in being the thing you'll have to pay for again in the NHS, typically with your house or whatever else, to pay for healthcare in that care home. Back to R.D. Lang. I had the dubious privilege of rummaging through his library. He trained as a doctor at the University of Glasgow. He also trained later at the Tavistock Clinic as a psychoanalyst. Well, I'll come back to that. So Lang trained as a very orthodox psychiatrist, did his national service in the Royal Army Medical Corps, was able to observe, for example, people being treated with insulin coma therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, often at a time when they didn't necessarily get a muscle relaxant, so you saw a full grand mal fit. And he naturally developed a kind of critique of psychiatry of a sort. He was hugely influenced, as I say, by the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, and it's that really that influenced the divided self and others. I met Ronald David Lang's son, Adrian Lang, who's also his biographer, and whose biography of his dad is called, somewhat unimaginatively, R.D. Lang, A Life. I said to Adrian Lang, I was at the sort of conference where they handed over the the R.D. Lang archives to the University of Glasgow for an undisclosed sum. And I said, oh, any questions? Pick me. And I said, what was his politics? And Adrian Lang said something which I thought really did sum it up quite nicely. He said, he was a reactionary against the status quo. Whatever it was, he was against it. But he said, if he was among Marxists, he spoke fluent Marxese. If he was among Buddhists, he was a Buddhist. And actually, when I was rooting through his library, oh, the 3 volumes of Capital. Sure enough, there they are. And volume 1, let's have a look. He'd read the whole thing, cover to cover, annotated throughout. Volume 2, not a sausage. Volume 3, pristine, there we go. And there wasn't a lot else spoken. Anyway, the point I'm getting to really is it was that milieu of radicalism in the 1960s and 70s that really made R.D. Lang and really made his type of critique of psychiatry the kind of go-to one for a lot of people on the left. But for a lot of people on the left, psychiatry was the problem. Psychiatrists are controlling the population. No, they're not. What controls the population is commodity fetishism. And if commodity fetishism isn't controlling the population, then the reserve army of labour is controlling the population. Psychiatry's got bugger all to do with it. Yes, of course, psychiatry and psychiatric nurses and social workers and a whole range of other people who work within the criminal justice system carry out state roles, but it's not that that stops revolution. At the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London, in the Roundhouse in 1967, R.D. Lang was one of the speakers, along with Stokely Carmichael, Herbert Marcuse, and a whole range of other people, which we now associate with the New Left. And a book was published called The Dialectics of Liberation, in which David Cooper talks about anti-psychiatry, referring to himself and R.D. Lang as anti-psychiatrists. Lang never did, by the way. He didn't regard himself as an anti-psychiatrist. He just didn't bother to read the proofs. He didn't bother to correct what David Cooper had said. But what you then got was something quite interesting. R.D. Lang was one of the first people to review Michel Foucault's book, which is now in English called Madness and Civilization. In French, it's called Histoire de la Folie. I'm not a French speaker, but as I understand it, the best translation of Histoire de la Folie would be, say, A History of Insanity. But in English, it's called Madness and Civilization. And if you go to a conference of, say, the British Sociological Association, what you'll hear all the time is madness and the other, or madness and fish fingers, or whatever. And terms like madness are used as a kind of way of arguably getting away from the positivist controlling medicine. And I've had the dubious privilege of sitting through sociology courses where people talk about the medicalization of society. The medicalization. And of course, you hear this from politicians all the time as well. Instead of just sadness, it's medicalized into being depression. Let's get something straight. Suicide is one of the biggest killers of particularly of men of a certain age, typically younger people. Suicide after road traffic collisions and things like that is one of the biggest killers of young men in particular. The mortality rate for anorexia nervosa is about 10%. What other diseases do you know which have a mortality rate of 10%? Most of them are, and yet some people's response to anorexia nervosa is, well, just eat your bloody dinner. The point I'm making is that mental illness is real and it should be taken seriously, it should be dealt with scientifically, and it should be dealt with by compassion, and it should be taken seriously by communists. Michel Foucault wrote his book, Madness and Civilization, in a sense has a lot to answer for. You see really a kind of spurious piece of historiography being passed off as a kind of critique of psychiatry. He does something similar with the birth of the clinic and so on. He does have insights, and I'm not saying don't read it. I'm saying read it. It's fascinating. But I always used to say to my students, well, read it. If it sounds weird and you don't understand it, it's not you. Read it and read it like a novel. Just enjoy it. Just let it wash over you. There's no theory there because he would deny that you could possibly have a theory. And that's one of the features of what happens when the left leaves the field open to these chances. And Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, for all its undoubted insights, there's no relationship, as it were, between the great growth of asylum building and the development of capitalism, except as a kind of tangential way. And yet, how can you separate out the growth of the asylums from the growth of the poor law, the control of the poor and the relationship, therefore, to the asylums? You have to be able to separate out those who cannot work and would be highly disruptive in a poor law institution, a workhouse, and put them somewhere else. So you see the growth of the workhouses and the growth of the asylums is in parallel. Foucault has also influenced a whole generation of sociologists who have abandoned any kind of discussion of class whatsoever. Go to a British Sociological Association conference and start talking about class, and it's as if you farted in church. There's no attempt to really explain class at all, and there's certainly no attempt to look at the relationship between class and the decline of capitalism. So, which brings me neatly on to Soviet psychiatry. In a sense, this is the one example of the state actively using psychiatry for repression. I've put it in here because it's something which is unusual. It is the exception in the sense that proves the rule. Psychiatry doesn't generally do this. The idea that people are put into psychiatric hospitals, and everybody will say, oh, they used to put people who had a child out of wedlock. And I'm sure that I saw lots of people myself, elderly people in psychiatric hospitals, who I couldn't find anything wrong with them, but they were simply institutional. People ended up in psychiatric hospitals for all sorts of reasons. But it wasn't a state policy to repress a potentially rebellious working class. If you look at some of R.D. Laing's work, the idea you have almost what's his name? I've forgotten. Anyway, you get this idea that somehow psychiatric patients, along with a whole load of other kind of dissident parts of the population, constitute a restive restive sort of movement for change. As Marxists, we know it's the international proletariat. Now, what about Soviet psychiatry? The point is, of course, that this book was also in R.D. Laing's library, and he was fully aware of it. He was fully aware of the political abuse of psychiatry in the USSR. There were other aspects to it. The search for a Marxist psychology. When we go into the Revolutionary Communist Party 2.0, went to one of their conferences before the most recent one. Went to one of their conferences, and there was somebody up there, and they were talking about Vygotsky, Lev Sergeyevich Vygotsky, who was actually a very interesting psychologist, a very interesting critic of Piaget, well worth reading, not worth expounding as a paradigm example of Marxist psychology. What the hell would a Marxist psychology be anyway? And so what you get is, in the Soviet Union is the only state that has ever had a state-funded psychoanalytical clinic to treat the children traumatized by revolution and war. And it was open for a few years immediately after the revolution, but was fairly quickly closed down. But later, what you saw was people making their careers by denouncing other people. And people who, for example, might have started off as interested in psychoanalysis, Alexander Luria, for example, eventually ditched that in favor of a type of psychology which was very close to American behaviorism. It had the social content sucked out of it. You could be as Pavlovian as you liked. You could, and of course Pavlov, although he was a right-wing loyalist to the Tsar, was actively supported by the Soviet Union. Why? Because his research was crucially important. He was also one of Russia's very few Nobel laureates. And of course, he got good facilities. And isn't it therefore interesting that Trotsky defends both Pavlov and Freud as both being compatible with a scientific approach to psychology? Trotsky talks about Freud's sometimes fantastic conjectures. He's not wrong there. But the point is, of course, what Trotsky's not doing is say, let's all go and be psychoanalysts. And that's, psychoanalysis is the way to have a science of psychology. He's saying, he's distancing himself, he's against using this or that so-called scientists as something that would be the paradigm example of a Marxist psychology, and that extends to a whole range of other things. I mentioned Lamarckianism, the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And of course, this was expounded by the complete charlatan by the name of Trofim Lysenko. And if you weren't a Lysenkoist, you could end up in a camp, quite frankly. And similarly, you saw a macabre type of social mobility through the denunciation of one scientist or another because they weren't in conformity with the latest thinking on psychology or evolution or whatever else. Took me back to what people were talking about yesterday in the discussion of the SWP. So the political abuse of psychiatry took place at certain times and in certain ways. It was an ameliorated form of the labour camp, largely used against the dissident intelligentsia. It wasn't used against the working class. They'd be shot in the time-honored fashion or sent off to a camp or whatever else. But and it also didn't happen under Lenin. There wasn't any psychiatry. What there was so rudimentary, you couldn't have been used anyway. It wouldn't have crossed his mind. Didn't happen under Stalin. Why? Just have been shot. In fact, there is some evidence that psychiatrists played something of a heroic role when people were being dragged off and shot in the 1930s. That people, if say they got drunk and told a joke about Stalin and were dragged off by the NKVD, they'd be sent off to a psychiatric hospital. And it was, oh yes, he's got schizophrenia or something, and they would keep him in for about 3 months, then discharge him as cured, probably saved his life. And at the same time, so what you then tended to get is really after the death of Stalin, when you needed to make some kind of concessions to the intelligentsia, you needed to make some kind of, you needed to be able to get the intelligentsia to make the system work. So if you're going to sort of drag them off to the gulag, then that's not going to work. You can't just terrorize physicists and expect them to produce their best work. So as a way of kind of controlling a dissident intelligentsia, most of whom wanted to transition to capitalism, psychiatric hospitals were used because it could be passed off as a sort of solicitude for the welfare of these people, whilst at the same time keeping them under control. There are other examples that people could cite. Ezra Pound, for example, was locked up in a psychiatric hospital after the Second World War because he was a fascist. And one possibility is he was described as mentally ill because otherwise he could have been just executed. Perhaps it would have been embarrassing to the US government. Siegfried Sassoon went sent for a psychiatric assessment during the First World War for deciding that slaughter on that kind of industrial scale wasn't such a great idea. This is despite having won the military cross. And he decided he was opposed to the war. He was sent not to some big old asylum. He wasn't sort of electrocuted in some godforsaken asylum somewhere. He went to what was quite a nice little spa. It's still there, by the way, Craig Lockhart, which is, of course, where he met Wilfred Owen. And it was after that Wilfred Owen wrote some of his finest work. So the state, you could argue, there are isolated instances, but the Soviet Union was the one case where psychiatry was used to suppress a dissident intelligence at a particular time, and it has pretty much stopped by the time we got to Gorbachev. So what's the practical application? This is kind of personal. In 1982, I was on strike in what was one of a number of TUC coordinated one-day actions, which at the time was the largest kind of mobilization of the working class since the general strike. You had miners and postmen on the picket line at Redhill General Hospital, where I was out. You had more postmen and train drivers and God knows what, than you had medical staff. It was extraordinary. And this is Redhill in Surrey, God almighty. I was the only nurse that come out, and I was in school at the time, so I couldn't, it wasn't as if I was walking off the ward and leaving, but a lot of nurses wouldn't even come out in their dinner break. I was sitting in the cabinet, sitting in the National Archives and looking at the cabinet minutes for 1982. And Norman Fowler is minuted saying, no one has yet beaten the nurses. There was an immediate recognition that what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to buy off the nurses, and I would include in that, by the way, midwives. So we're going to negotiate separately with the Royal College of Nursing and the Royal College of Midwives. There were different days of action which involved solidarity action from a wide range of different workers, including, for example, print workers. And I would argue that this was really the dress rehearsal for the defeat of the miners' strike. It was all the legislation that was subsequently used was first of all tried out in the 82 Health Workers Dispute. Sean Garrity, for example, who was a print workers leader, defied the newly introduced laws against solidarity action and ended up in court. Refused to pay the fine. And so what you then had is the prospect that a print workers union leader would be arrested and imprisoned, which would have brought out all of Fleet Street. People have speculated as to whether it was Robert Maxwell or whoever that paid his fine, but nevertheless the fine was paid and they didn't go to the brink. They weren't quite strong enough. But this, in a sense, was the beginning of the kind of anti-union legislation which has been a feature of the entire Conservative administration, and of course now the subsequent Labour administrations who've never rescinded any of it. The outcome, despite the fact that all health workers were united behind a 12% pay rise, the Royal Colleges of Nursing and Midwifery were bought off with a 6.4 pay rise and a promise of a pay review body, which actually delivered substantial gains for nurses and midwives, qualified ones, not the unqualified ones, not the nursing auxiliaries at this time. And the rest got 4%. And what this also meant was this was the green light for widespread privatisation within the NHS. And so a whole series of all the ancillary services could be contracted out, not necessarily because it was cheaper, but because it helped to control the workforce. And by the way, this was an acceleration of the closure of the asylums. Nobody, there were 42 wards at Netherland Hospital. I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who was in the Royal College of Nursing in the old asylums. This was the trade union base of the NHS. The closure of the asylums was effectively the closure of the trade union base of the NHS. And what you also got is as I say, the separating out of nurses and midwives, qualified nurses and midwives, not the unqualified ones, not the ones who did a huge proportion and an increasingly large proportion of the direct clinical nursing. And effectively, the recent defeats effectively within the NHS, despite the fact that the Royal College of Nursing has abandoned its no strike rule and has actually taken people out on strike for the first time, the seeds of their defeat were sown in 82. No surprises there. So, comrades, in conclusion, I just want to say we should take health seriously, we should take mental health particularly seriously, because if we don't, it will be left to the hands of fools. And beyond that, any kind of discussion around health also means taking a look at one of the biggest single sections of the British working class. How many people are engaged in healthcare? Not just in the NHS, with hundreds of thousands of workers, but also throughout the care home sector, which is treated in a far, far worse way. Communism is about health. It's about the achievement of what it is to be truly human. Thank you.